High above the humid coastline of WWII, New Guinea, a single P-38 Lightning slowly drifts away from its formation. The other American fighters dive toward the battle forming below. Japanese aircraft are climbing into the blazing tropical sun, while bombers skim dangerously low across the jungle canopy, trying to escape. But one pilot does something unexpected. He doesn't chase. He doesn't dive. Instead, he circles. From a distance, he watches the fight unfold, studying it with quiet concentration. His eyes move constantly across the sky, measuring distances, tracking aircraft, observing the angles of every turn and climb. Inside the cockpit, Captain Thomas McGuire is not fighting. He is calculating. His wingmen glance back at him in confusion. One of them mutters over the radio that maybe their leader has lost his nerve. Later, when they land, someone will probably accuse him of hesitation. But McGuire knows exactly what he is doing, because he has begun to understand something most fighter pilots never realize. Aerial combat is not chaos. It is mathematics, and he intends to prove it. By late 1943, the skies above the Southwest Pacific have become one of the most unforgiving battlefields of the war. American pilots fly from crude airstrips carved out of jungle mud, places like Port Moresby, Dobadura, and Nadzab. These bases are little more than long scars cut through the forest, surrounded by mountains, swamps, and endless green jungle. Every mission begins with distance. Hundreds of miles of ocean and wilderness separate the Allied bases from Japanese positions. If an engine fails out here, there are no friendly villages, no roads, often not even clear ground. A pilot forced down into the jungle faces heat, disease, insects, and the very real possibility of never being found. Rescue missions are rare. Survival is rarer. The air war in the Pacific bears little resemblance to the massive battles being fought over Europe. There are no thousand-plane bomber streams, no tight defensive formations surrounded by dozens of escort fighters. Instead, the Pacific War in the air is a game of interception. Small groups of fighters sweep across islands searching for enemy aircraft, cargo ships, or hidden airfields. Battles erupt suddenly and violently, often at low altitude, where mountains and jungle rise dangerously close beneath the wings. Mistakes happen fast, and they are usually fatal. The environment itself becomes an enemy. The tropical heat presses against aircraft like a physical weight. Inside their cockpits, pilots sweat constantly. Their flight suits soak through long before the first enemy aircraft appears. Aluminum skin absorbs the blazing sunlight until the aircraft feel almost too hot to touch. After long missions, many pilots climb out of their cockpits, shaking with exhaustion. Some are dehydrated. Others collapse from heat and fatigue. Meanwhile, disease spreads quietly through the camps. Malaria, dysentery, tropical fevers. Sometimes these claim more pilots than enemy fighters. Despite all of this, by the fall of 1943, the 5th Air Force is slowly gaining control of the skies. But victory comes with a price. Veteran pilots who survived dozens of missions are rotated back to the United States. In their place come young replacements. They are brave. They are eager. But many of them have far fewer training hours than the pilots they replace. Some have barely practiced aerial gunnery. Others have never experienced a real dogfight. And the sky is not forgiving. The aircraft they fly is formidable. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning is one of the most advanced fighters in the Pacific theater. With its distinctive twin-boom design, 2 powerful engines, and concentrated nose-mounted guns, it is both fast and deadly. The P-38 can climb quickly, dive faster than most Japanese aircraft, and deliver devastating firepower in a short burst. In skilled hands, it is lethal. But skill requires experience. And experience requires time. Time that many young pilots simply do not have. Official doctrine makes combat sound simple. Engage the enemy. Protect the bombers. Support the ground forces. Press the attack. But doctrine cannot prepare a pilot for the reality of a turning fight at 300 miles per hour, when vision narrows under stress and G-forces crush against the chest. In those moments, decisions are made in fractions of seconds. Most pilots rely on instinct. They chase. They react. They trust speed and firepower to save them. Sometimes that works. Sometimes it doesn't. Thomas McGuire watches these battles carefully. Unlike many of the men around him, he is not satisfied with instinct alone. He wants to understand why certain pilots survive while others disappear. After each mission, he returns to his tent and pulls out a small notebook. While other pilots relax at the mess hall or fall asleep from exhaustion, McGuire studies. He sketches diagrams of dogfights. He records altitudes, attack angles, and escape routes. He writes down questions. Why did that enemy fighter break left instead of right? How much altitude can a P-38 convert into speed before control becomes dangerous? What firing distance produces the highest probability of a hit? To McGuire, aerial combat begins to resemble a puzzle. Every maneuver consumes or creates energy. Altitude becomes speed. Speed becomes maneuverability. Position becomes opportunity. Victory, he realizes, often belongs not to the bravest pilot, but to the one who manages these elements most effectively. Combat is not chaos. It is geometry in motion. At first, the other pilots do not know what to make of him. Some admire his discipline. Others tease him for overthinking everything. One squadron mate jokes that McGuire treats aerial combat like a college exam. But McGuire does not mind the jokes, because slowly the patterns reveal themselves. Enemy pilots behave predictably. They lure American fighters into turning battles near the ground. They climb sharply to bleed speed from pursuers. They rarely attack unless they hold a positional advantage. They are not reacting randomly. They are setting traps. And American pilots, aggressive and confident, walk directly into them. McGuire reaches a quiet conclusion. Aerial combat is not a series of random encounters. It is a chain of decisions. Each decision creates new possibilities or eliminates them. A pilot who can think 2 or 3 moves ahead can control the fight. Like a chess player controlling the board. Only here the pieces move at 300 miles per hour. And the cost of a mistake is death. The next time McGuire flies into combat, he does something different. Instead of rushing toward the first opportunity for a kill, he climbs higher than the rest of his formation. From that altitude he watches. He waits. And when the moment finally arrives, he dives with perfect timing. One burst of gunfire. One enemy aircraft falls from the sky. Then he climbs away before the others can respond. It is clean, efficient, and repeatable. For Thomas McGuire, the sky has become something entirely different. Not an arena for reckless heroism, but a chessboard. Once Thomas McGuire began looking at aerial combat as a system instead of a blur of instinct and adrenaline, patterns appeared everywhere. They revealed themselves slowly through repetition. Mission after mission over New Guinea, he watched how Japanese fighters maneuvered. He saw how they tried to draw American aircraft into low-altitude turning fights where speed disappeared and maneuverability mattered more than firepower. He noticed how enemy pilots used vertical climbs to bleed speed from pursuers, forcing them into awkward angles where they could counterattack. And most importantly, he realized something few American pilots had yet accepted. The Japanese were not improvising. They were setting traps. American pilots, aggressive by training and confident in their aircraft, often reacted exactly the way the enemy expected. They chased the first target they saw. They dove after damaged fighters. They followed fleeing aircraft downward until the fight became chaotic and confused. And sometimes, hidden above or behind them, another enemy fighter waited for that exact moment. McGuire understood that the battle in the sky wasn't random. It was a sequence of decisions. Every maneuver created new options or destroyed them. If a pilot could think 2 or 3 moves ahead, he could shape the entire engagement. It was chess played in 3 dimensions, with altitude and speed acting as pieces on the board. McGuire began testing these ideas carefully. He didn't abandon combat or avoid danger. Instead, he approached every fight with deliberate control. Often he would climb higher than the rest of his flight before entering the battle, sacrificing the chance for the first attack in exchange for better position. If an enemy aircraft broke away from the formation, McGuire frequently refused to chase it. Losing altitude or separation from his wingman, he believed, was rarely worth a single kill. Other pilots found this behavior frustrating. During one mission, a fellow pilot confronted him after they returned to base. A Japanese fighter had peeled away from the main formation and descended rapidly. It looked like an easy target. McGuire had let it go. The other pilot was furious. That was a free victory, he argued. Why didn't we take it? McGuire explained calmly that the aircraft had probably been acting as bait. The enemy pilot was trying to draw them downward, away from their formation, and into a lower altitude where additional fighters could attack. The risk, he said, outweighed the reward. The pilot walked away unconvinced. But McGuire continued refining his ideas. Gradually, his thinking formed a clear structure. He broke aerial combat down into several essential principles. Energy management. Altitude and speed were interchangeable currencies. A pilot who controlled both controlled the fight. Position. Never begin an engagement without an advantage in angle or altitude. Patience. The best firing opportunity was the one that developed naturally, not the one forced through desperation. Mutual support. Two aircraft working together could defeat four acting independently. These ideas were simple, but their application required discipline. McGuire began sharing them quietly with younger pilots in his squadron. He rarely gave formal lectures. Instead, he spoke during pre-flight briefings or while standing beside aircraft during maintenance checks. Sometimes he would draw diagrams in the dirt. Other times he walked pilots through hypothetical combat scenarios. Some of them listened carefully. Others dismissed him as a man who spent too much time thinking instead of fighting. But something interesting began to happen. The pilots who listened started surviving more missions. By late 1943, McGuire's ideas had evolved into a complete tactical system. It wasn't official doctrine yet. No training manuals mentioned it. But within the squadron, the method became recognizable. The core concept was simple: mutual support through altitude discipline. Before entering combat, McGuire's flight climbed higher than most pilots felt comfortable with. They positioned themselves above and behind the enemy formation, where they could watch the battle develop. Sometimes this meant waiting while other American fighters rushed into the attack. McGuire was willing to let them. Patience was part of the strategy. When the enemy formation committed itself, when its attention was focused on defending against attacks below, McGuire's flight would strike. But they didn't dive recklessly. They descended in controlled, high-speed passes, maintaining separation and energy. One pair attacked. The other remained above, covering the maneuver and ready to intercept enemy fighters attempting to counterattack. After the attack, they didn't stay and turn. They extended away from the fight, using speed to climb back to altitude and reset the engagement. Then they could repeat the process again. It wasn't glamorous, but it was devastating. The effectiveness of the system became clear on December 26, 1943, during an interception near Cape Gloucester. McGuire's flight encountered a large group of Japanese aircraft moving along the coast. Rather than diving immediately into the formation, he climbed higher and waited for the perfect moment. Then he attacked. The lightning streaked downward in a controlled pass. McGuire fired a short burst and destroyed his first target. Instead of turning to dogfight, he extended away and climbed again. Another pass. Another enemy aircraft falling in flames. By the time the engagement ended, McGuire had destroyed 3 enemy fighters. His wingman shot down 2 more. Both aircraft returned safely to base. No damage. No injuries. The rest of the squadron noticed. By early 1944, Thomas McGuire had become something unusual within the 5th Air Force. Not just an ace, an informal instructor. Pilots began asking him to review their combat tactics. Some requested to fly on his wing just to watch how he positioned his aircraft during engagements. They noticed how calm he remained even when the sky filled with tracer fire. Promotions followed as his reputation grew. Captain, then Major. His victory count climbed steadily, 5, 10, 15. But unlike many aces, McGuire's victories did not come from reckless aggression. They came from careful calculation. He still carried the small notebook strapped to his leg. After every mission, he wrote down what happened. He studied gun camera footage frame by frame, examining the geometry of each attack. Other pilots sometimes scored more victories in a single day. Some had more natural flying talent. But no one in the 5th Air Force understood the mechanics of air combat more deeply than Thomas McGuire. And that understanding was saving lives. By the summer of 1944, the 475th Fighter Group had become one of the most effective fighter units in the Pacific. Their loss rates dropped. Their victory totals increased. New replacement pilots survived their early missions more often. The change wasn't magic. It was discipline. It was patience. It was the stubborn belief that even war could be understood if someone was willing to study it closely enough. And in the skies above New Guinea, Thomas McGuire continued refining the system that would change the way American fighter pilots fought. But the moment that defined his legacy had not yet come. By the end of 1944, Thomas McGuire had become one of the most respected fighter pilots in the Pacific. His victory total had climbed to 38 confirmed kills, making him the second highest-scoring American ace in the theater. Only Major Richard Bong had more. But McGuire was never obsessed with the scoreboard. He was obsessed with understanding combat. Even after hundreds of missions, he continued studying every engagement. He still carried the small notebook strapped to his flight leg, still reviewed gun camera footage frame by frame, still analyzed mistakes and patterns with the careful attention of a scientist. To many younger pilots, McGuire had become something more than an ace. He was a teacher. Pilots who flew beside him noticed the same things again and again. He rarely rushed into a fight. He positioned his aircraft carefully before attacking. He maintained altitude whenever possible and avoided unnecessary turning battles. To McGuire, the sky was never chaos. It was a board of angles, vectors, and energy. Every engagement was a puzzle. On Christmas Day, 1944, McGuire led another fighter sweep over the island of Los Negros in the Admiralty Islands. It was the kind of mission he had flown dozens of times. Clear the sky. Protect American bombers. Intercept any Japanese aircraft attempting to approach Allied positions. McGuire's flight climbed steadily over the tropical waters until they reached the patrol area. The weather was clear and the visibility nearly perfect. Soon they spotted enemy aircraft. A small group of Japanese fighters flying low over the island. The tactical situation looked ideal. McGuire's flight had altitude, position, and numerical advantage. It should have been a textbook engagement. But combat rarely unfolds according to textbooks. One of McGuire's wingmen was a young pilot who had joined the unit only recently. He was eager, aggressive, and determined to prove himself. When the enemy fighters appeared, the young pilot reacted instantly. He broke formation. Without waiting for instructions, he dove after one of the Japanese aircraft. McGuire saw the danger immediately. The enemy fighter was acting as bait. Other Japanese aircraft were nearby, waiting for exactly this kind of reckless pursuit. McGuire keyed his radio and ordered the pilot to hold position. But the warning came too late. The young pilot was already committed to the dive. And in that moment, McGuire faced a decision. For nearly 2 years, he had taught other pilots to fight intelligently. He had warned them not to sacrifice altitude or position for emotion. He had insisted that discipline mattered more than bravery. Now one of his own wingmen was flying directly into a trap. McGuire could have stayed above the fight. He could have protected the rest of the formation and allowed the reckless pilot to face the consequences of his mistake. That would have followed his own tactical rules perfectly. But McGuire made a different choice. He dove after him, not to chase a victory, to protect his wingman. The P-38 Lightning roared downward toward the fight. Below them, the air battle was already forming. Japanese fighters maneuvered sharply, climbing and turning through the humid tropical sky. McGuire pushed his aircraft harder, trying to reach the endangered pilot before the enemy could close in. But there was one critical detail he had overlooked. His Lightning was still carrying external fuel tanks. The long-range tanks allowed the aircraft to fly great distances across the Pacific, but they also created drag and additional weight. Standard procedure required pilots to jettison them before combat. In the urgency of the moment, McGuire hadn't done it. The extra weight changed the way the aircraft handled. It reduced responsiveness, and at low altitude, small differences in performance could be fatal. McGuire maneuvered aggressively, trying to position himself between the enemy fighters and his wingman. He pulled the Lightning into a sharp left turn. The aircraft responded sluggishly. He tightened the turn, attempting to bring his guns onto a Japanese fighter approaching from behind. But the combination of heavy fuel tanks, high speed, and tight maneuvering pushed the aircraft beyond its limits. The Lightning stalled. At higher altitude, a stall could be recovered. But McGuire was flying dangerously close to the ground. The aircraft snapped into a roll. The nose dropped sharply, and before recovery was possible, the twin-boom fighter plunged into the jungle below. Thomas McGuire was 24 years old. His death on January 7, 1945 sent shockwaves through the 5th Air Force. Pilots across the Pacific had flown with him, studied his tactics, and respected his calm intelligence in the cockpit. Many struggled to understand how a pilot so disciplined could die in such a way. The answer, ironically, was the very principle he had spent years teaching: mutual support. McGuire had always believed that fighter pilots were responsible for protecting one another. On that final mission, he followed that belief, even when it meant breaking his own tactical rules. Some later called it a tragic mistake. Others saw it differently. They believed it was the ultimate expression of the philosophy he had taught, that a fighter formation was more than a group of individuals. It was a team, and a leader never abandoned his wingman. McGuire was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration in the United States. The citation praised his courage, his exceptional flying skill, and his devotion to duty. But those who knew him best believed his greatest contribution was something deeper than bravery. It was intellect. He had demonstrated that air combat could be studied, understood, and improved. That instinct alone was not enough. Preparation, discipline, and analysis could make the difference between life and death. After the war, the principles McGuire had developed in the skies above New Guinea gradually became part of official fighter doctrine. Concepts like energy management, altitude advantage, and mutual support were incorporated into fighter training programs. At places like Nellis Air Force Base, instructors began teaching new generations of pilots the same lessons McGuire had discovered in his notebook. He had never written a formal manual. He had never delivered lectures to high-ranking officers. But his ideas spread because they worked, because they saved lives. Today, McGuire's legacy survives in places far from the jungles where he fought. McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey bears his name. A memorial stands in Sebring, Florida, where he spent his childhood. But perhaps the most lasting tribute exists within the fighter pilot community itself. Among those who study the history of aerial warfare, McGuire is remembered not only as a legendary ace, but as a man who changed the way pilots think. He proved something simple and profound: that courage and intellect are not opposites, that aggression and discipline can coexist, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon a pilot carries into battle is not mounted on his aircraft. It is the one inside his mind.